Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission here is, as always, the same.
We take a huge stack of source material, biographies, critical essays, you name it, and we build the ultimate shortcut to being well-informed.
Today, we are immersing ourselves in the dizzying, precise, and profoundly influential universe engineered by Jorge Luis Borges.
And it is so essential we do this justice.
Why so?
Well, because Borges, the Argentine master, is arguably the most important intellectual pivot point in 20th century literature.
That's a huge claim.
It is. But he sits right on that line. He is the bridge between high modernism, with its concerns about fragmentation, and postmodernism's obsession with structure, information, and, well, simulation.
Absolutely. And the sources we have for this deep dive are, they're incredibly comprehensive. They track not only his literary techniques, but also the intense philosophical and political battles that really defined his life.
Right.
So for you, the learner, our mission is to move far beyond that basic image of the blind man wandering through the archives.
We want to show how Borges didn't just write stories.
Yeah.
He engineered new literary forms. He was an architect of what we now call narrative nonlinearity.
A true innovator. The critic J.M. Coetzee put it perfectly, I think.
What did he say?
He said Borges renovated the language of fiction.
And that renovation, it happened across so many forms. He was a poet, an essayist, a translator.
But his global reputation, that really rests on his short story collections.
Primarily Ficciones and LLF.
Both from the 1940s.
And these works are like, they're like intellectual puzzles. They explore concepts that feel so contemporary.
Eerily so. Infinity, the illusory nature of time, self-referential systems.
And the overwhelming nature of archives.
Yeah.
The feeling of being drowned in information.
The genius is that he managed to synthesize mythology, mathematics, and philosophy into these miniature fictional universes.
On just a few pages.
It's dense material, for sure, but we'll guide you through it all. The fascinating biographical ironies, the philosophical hoaxes he championed, and the political resistance that really characterized his career.
Okay, let's start with the man himself.
Let's do it. Let's unpack the accidental education that created this strange architect. To begin, we have to plant our flag in Buenos Aires.
Right. That's where Jorge Francisco Isidoro Luis Borges was born in 1899.
What a name.
It is. And he was born into an educated middle-class family. But what's instantly fascinating is the sheer cultural cocktail of his heritage.
That mixed lineage was absolutely crucial, wasn't it?
Oh, completely. He had these deep roots in military and early Argentine history on his mother's side, the Criollo, the Spanish-Argentine side.
But then you have this other very strong influence.
The English influence from his father, Jorge Guillermo Borges Haslam, who was half English.
And this blend, it wasn't just a genealogical footnote, you know?
No, not at all. It structured his entire intellectual environment.
It certainly did. I mean, he was remarkably bilingual from his earliest years.
Speaking Spanish and English simultaneously.
And his proficiency in English just allowed him to read the foundational texts of Western literature directly.
The sources note he was tackling Shakespeare in English by age 12.
Just think about that for a second. The level of fluency, the complexity at such a young age.
And this brings us to what Borges himself defined as the chief event of his life.
Not his first publication, not a literary prize.
No. His father's private English library, which contained well over 1,000 volumes.
It's an amazing detail. This wasn't just a domestic collection.
It was more like a self-contained liberal arts university in his own home.
So he grew up literally surrounded by the entire history of English literature.
From the Anglo-Saxons right up to the Victorians, it was all there.
And that library was the initial laboratory for his mind. But it wasn't just, passive absorption. He was already producing.
There's that fantastic anecdote.
I love this one.
At just 10 years old, he translates Oscar Wilde's The Happy Prince into Spanish.
And it gets published in a local journal. What was the reaction?
Well, the sources point to an inherent irony there, too. His friends, and most of the readers, they just assumed the published piece must have been his father's work.
Which is fascinating, because his father was a lawyer and a psychology teacher.
Right, but he also harbored these frustrated literary ambitions.
Yeah.
So this early confusion, it foreshadows Borges's later themes about the nature of authorship and, authenticity.
It also hints at that complex relationship with his father, who cast this long shadow. Borges was acutely aware of his own difference. He knew he'd be a bookish kind of person and not a man of action. which was so different from the soldiers he admired in his ancestry.
And the father, though, he provided the immediate catalyst for the family's big shift.
To Europe.
Precisely.
Mm.
In 1914, the family moved to Geneva, Switzerland.
And the primary reason for this relocation was, tragically, very pragmatic.
It was his father's eyesight. He was progressively losing his sight from a degenerative disorder.
A condition that Borges himself would later inherit.
And the family ended up staying for 7 years. They were sort of trapped there by the outbreak of World War I and then political instability back in Argentina.
So Borges suddenly finds himself in Geneva studying at the Collège de Genève during wartime.
A huge shift. He learned French, deepened his reading of English authors like Thomas Carlyle.
And then, crucially, he started grappling with philosophy written in German.
This was just an explosion of intellectual expansion for him. But maybe the most formative period came right after, in Spain.
Yes, upon moving to Spain, he just dives headfirst into the avant-garde scene.
He joins the ultraist literary movement.
Can you unpack what that was?
Sure. It was a direct reaction against the ornate, often overly sentimental style of modernismo.
So they were stripping things down.
Exactly. Ultraism emphasized stark metaphor, free verse, and a real distillation of language. That focus on precision and economy would become a trademark of Borges' own style.
And it was here he published his first poem, Hymn to the Sea.
It was. But the real seeds of the Borgesian universe, the one built on illusion and skepticism, they weren't sown by poetry.
It was philosophy.
It was philosophy. The sources consistently highlight two monumental influences.
The first being?
The German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer.
Right.
Schopenhauer's metaphysical theory, particularly the concept that the phenomenal world, the world we perceive, is largely a manifestation of an underlying will or even an illusion, that became foundational for Borges.
So his later obsessions with dreams, mirrors, alternative realities, it all stems directly from that philosophical bedrock.
It does. And the second influence was a novel.
Gustav Meyrink's The Golem.
Yes. This German novel, which is just steeped in esoteric themes and Kabbalistic lore, it introduced Borges to the power of the urban labyrinth and the concept of a simulated or artificial man.
So you have this sense of ancient mystery and engineered reality.
And that provided the perfect fictional framework for Schopenhauer's idealism.
So he returns to Argentina in 1921, armed with the whole of European literature and philosophy, but, you know, he needs a livelihood.
Which is where we confront the first major irony, the government-subsidized writer.
It's incredible. Despite his burgeoning reputation as a writer, contributing to literary journals, he takes a job in 1938 at the Miguel Canet Municipal Library.
And the conditions of the job are, well, they're legendarily absurd. They perfectly illustrate the bureaucratic ennui he often wrote about.
Tell us about the job itself.
He was hired as a cataloger. On his very first day, he's explicitly told by his superior that cataloging more than 100 books a day was strongly discouraged.
Discouraged, why?
Because exceeding that number would make the rest of the staff look bad.
So he was actively punished for being efficient.
He was. And Borges, being highly efficient and focused, found he could complete his quota in about an hour.
And for the rest of the day?
He spent the remaining 7 hours of his shift writing, translating, and thinking, often relegated to the dusty basement stacks.
So it was basically a quiet, government-subsidized writing retreat hidden in plain sight.
Funded by the very state apparatus he would often critique. This job gave him the security and the solitude he needed to begin his most innovative work.
The irony just deepens in the following decades. The family condition, that progressive loss of sight, it culminates.
By the late 1950s, the man who lived for reading and writing was completely blind. Definitively so by age 55.
And this is where the sheer majesty of the timing just hits you.
In 1955, at the very moment he was engulfed by darkness.
He was appointed director of the Argentine National Public Library.
And simultaneously, a professor of English literature at the University of Buenos Aires.
The national custodian of books could no longer read them. It sounds like something straight out of one of his own fictions.
It does.
What was his intellectual response to this? I mean, this profound personal tragedy. It must have been devastating.
It was, of course. But Borges was a classicist at heart. He saw tragedy as a catalyst. How so? He noted that the loss of sight freed him from the visual world and pushed him toward intellectual and acoustic forms. He moved more and more toward poetry and shorter narratives.
Because he could compose them internally, memorize them.
Exactly. It forced him to rely on others for dictation, which also changed his creative process.
So the physical darkness actually enhanced his internal vision. It sharpened his focus on abstract symbols and eternal forms.
That's the interpretation he embraced. And his poetry just beautifully captures this terrible paradox.
There's that quote from Seven Nights.
Right, reflecting on God's splendid irony, he wrote, "No one should read self-pity or reproach into this statement of the majesty of God, who with such splendid irony at one touch granted me books and night."
Books and night.
The two core elements of his life, literature and darkness, were granted to him simultaneously. And he frames it not as cruelty, but as a form of divine, majestic irony.
It's a defining image that we have to carry forward with us.
It is.
That profound connection between the physical void and the philosophical search for light is foundational. And that search intensified in the years leading up to his blindness, following a massive personal crisis.
A near-fatal incident.
Let's transition now to how he actually invented a whole new way of writing after that. So the period between 1938 and 1941 was just transformative for him, and it was marked by intense trauma.
First, the death of his beloved father in 1938.
And then shortly after that, Borges suffered a severe head injury.
Right, he nearly died of sepsis during the treatment.
And this traumatic recovery period, where he was in an environment where he questioned his own sanity, it prompted him to just jettison the literary styles of his youth.
And develop the precise, paradoxical voice we recognize today. It was a real crucible moment for him.
He emerged from that trauma with a distinct new approach to narrative.
And his first major story in this new vein was Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote, which he published in 1939.
This story is the perfect entry point into Borges' intellectual universe.
It really is.
For the listener who hasn't encountered it, the premise is so simple, but it's revolutionary. Tell us about Menard.
Pierre Menard is a fictional 20th century French symbolist. And he decides not to copy Cervantes' Don Quixote.
Right.
He decides to rewrite it, word for word, through sheer exertion of will.
And he succeeds. He produces several chapters that are identical to the original.
The irony, of course, is that a sentence written by Cervantes in the 17th century about history as the mother of truth is, it's just a standard platitude of the time.
But when Menard writes the exact same line in the 20th century,
knowing everything that has transpired since,
it becomes startlingly profound, anachronistic.
Exactly. So it's not about the words themselves. It's about the context and the historical baggage they carry.
Borges is showing us that authorship isn't fixed, meaning is historical.
Precisely. It examines the nature of authorship, of literary reproduction. And this leads directly to his reliance on the literary forgery and pseudo-epigrapha,
which became a hallmark of his career, collected initially in A Universal History of Infamy.
He wasn't just writing new stories. He was claiming they were translations of obscure or even imaginary existing works.
Sometimes attributed to ancient Persian scholars or fictional mystics. Why the deliberate obfuscation? Why the literary hoax?
The rationale is absolutely key to his whole approach to literature, and he famously articulated it.
He believed that composing vast books, the typical sprawling 19th century novel, was a laborious madness.
Right. His better and more philosophical method was to pretend that those books already exist and offer a summary, a commentary on them.
So why write the entire library when the catalog entry, the critical review, is the true intellectual achievement? It's the ultimate conceptual shortcut.
It is. It's an act of deconstruction that's applied to creation itself. He saw the critical commentary as being superior to the original text.
Because it could encompass the entire imagined work in miniature.
And he certainly developed this from precursors. He references Thomas Carlyle's Sartor Resartus,
which was a critical review of a non-existent German transcendentalist text.
But Borges pushed it even further. He felt even Carlyle's work suffered from the imperfection that they themselves are books.
He wanted to write notes on imaginary books.
Yes, creating literature through the device of academic critique, which gives his prose that wonderful, dry, professorial tone, even when he's describing completely impossible events.
And this technique became the perfect vehicle for exploring the central motifs that define the Borgesian universe.
Dreams, infinity, mirrors, and labyrinths.
These aren't just decorative elements, are they? They are philosophical structures.
Absolutely.
Let's dedicate some time to these core conceptual structures, starting with maybe his most famous depiction of infinity.
Library of Babel.
In the Library of Babel, Borges envisions a universe that's composed of an infinite library,
It contains every book that could possibly be written.
each with 410 pages, uniform format with all possible variations of characters.
And because the library is infinite, it must contain true statements, false statements, gibberish.
And most frustratingly, the key to the library itself, the catalog.
Which is, of course, just another book lost somewhere in the library.
So the paradox here is that in a universe of infinite information, knowledge becomes impossible.
If everything that can be said has been said, then nothing has meaning.
Exactly. The human struggle in the story is this futile search for meaning within an infinite archive.
The sources describe the librarians' resulting despair, their tendency towards suicide, the rise of nihilistic cults who believe certain books are worthless and must be destroyed.
It's Borges using this structure to comment on the modern condition of information overload.
That feeling that we are drowning in data without the ability to synthesize wisdom.
It's a terrifying vision of the internet written decades before the internet existed, which brings us to Plon Ukbar Orbis Tertius.
Oh, yes.
Perhaps the story that most directly prefigures the simulation and the blurring of reality that we live with today.
This story is about the discovery of an encyclopedia entry describing a fictional planet, Tuamun.
And as scholars research this obscure, non-existent planet, the rules and concepts of Tlon,
Which include a radical philosophical idealism where objects cease to exist when they are not perceived.
those rules begin to infiltrate and eventually contaminate the real world. Objects from Tlon start spontaneously manifesting.
This is the ontological question applied to fiction. The ideas of this fake world are so compelling, so logically consistent, that they start replacing the rules of our own reality.
That's the dark core of it. The sources note that Borges is essentially describing a highly successful information operation.
A world so perfectly documented in its fictionality that it gains reality.
And the narrator concludes that the entire world will soon become Tlon.
It's pure information warfare. It shows how the desire for order and structure can lead to the embrace of a beautiful, systematic lie over chaotic, unpleasant reality.
So if Tlon is about the infiltration of ideas, The Garden of Forking Paths, published in 1941, is about dismantling linear time.
This story is crucial. This is the moment he anticipates the conceptual framework for hypertext and the multiverse.
It absolutely is. The story is a metafictional puzzle told by a Chinese spy named Yu Tsun.
Right. And he is trying to decipher a novel written by his ancestor, Qu Pen.
And this novel, which is also a physical labyrinth, it never resolves.
Because at every point, the protagonist chooses all possible outcomes simultaneously. If he enters a house, he also doesn't enter it, leading to countless branching narratives across time.
A combination of a book and a maze. This is why the term Borgesian became synonymous with narrative nonlinearity.
He took a spatial concept, the maze, and he applied it to temporal structure. He argued that the universe of his ancestor was not a spatial maze, but an infinite series of times in a growing, dizzying network of divergent, convergent, and parallel times.
And that, for a writer working decades before digital programming, is just astonishing.
He conceived of a network of potential narratives, where every decision opens new timelines and no single path is definitive.
It's a conceptual blueprint for interactive fiction digital archives.
Even the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, all encapsulated in a spy thriller.
This relentless questioning of reality and narrative structure, it leads us directly to the philosophical concept that actually bears his name.
The Borgesian conundrum.
What is it, fundamentally?
It's an ontological question.
Yeah.
A question about the nature of being, it asks. Whether the writer writes the story or it writes him.
It challenges the concept of singular, intentional creation.
Does the author truly invent the themes? Or do the themes, the collective human archive of history, myth, and psychology, simply use the author as a vessel to express themselves?
He expanded on this idea in that astonishing essay, Kafka and His Precursors.
One of the most brilliant pieces of literary criticism ever written.
Precisely because it uses this conundrum to rewrite history.
It's mind-bending. Borges identifies several older, seemingly unrelated texts, from Zeno of Elea to writings from the 19th century, and argues they all contain the thematic idiosyncrasies we now associate with Franz Kafka.
But then comes the punchline.
The punchline is that Borges argues that if Kafka had never written a single line, we would not perceive this quality in those older texts.
In other words, it would not exist.
So the present writer, Kafka, retroactively creates his own past. He changes the way we look at history and tradition.
And Borges concludes, every writer creates his own precursors.
It is genius literary revisionism. And Borges knew he was creating his own precursors, too.
His influence, built on these short, precise conceptual fictions, was massive.
It provided the essential toolkit for the magical realist movement in Latin America.
Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Julio Cortázar, and others.
They learned how to infuse the fantastic into the real world with this dry procedural logic, a technique they absorbed directly from Borges' faux academic style.
And his influence stretched far beyond the academy. He devoured genre fiction.
He certainly did. He had a deep critical understanding of science fiction Lovecraft, Heinlein, Bradbury.
And his work inspired entire generations of conceptual fiction writers, particularly those obsessed with archives, unstable reality, and simulation.
Philip K. Dick, Gene Wolfe.
William Gibson, the acknowledged father of cyberpunk, famously said that reading Trillin, Uqbar, Orbis Tertius felt like installing software that instantly increased his conceptual bandwidth.
It's a perfect description.
Borges didn't invent the internet, but he certainly invented the concept of the universally interconnected, potentially illusory, self-replicating information network.
He was defining the structure of the digital age using paper and ink.
And this structural innovation, this claim to a universal culture, was directly tied to his political identity as an Argentine writer.
Which brings us to the real-world fight that consumed his adult life.
So Borges spent decades building these fictional worlds of infinite archives and theoretical mathematics.
But he was also a fiercely political Argentine.
And his stance on nationalism, tradition, and dictatorship shaped his life as profoundly as any book he ever read.
Early in his career, he did briefly embrace a more local identity. He was part of the avant-garde Martin Fierro magazine,
which focused on Argentine sensibility, the gaucho figure.
But he quickly broke away from what he saw as literary constraints.
And that intellectual break came in his famous 1951 essay, The Argentine Writer and Tradition. What was his key argument here?
He argued forcefully against the notion that Argentine literature must be limited to local color.
To writing about gauchos and tangos and local customs?
Yes. He asserted that a writer from Argentina, writing from the geographical and cultural margins, had inherited the entirety of world literature.
So his marginal status was a strategic advantage.
Precisely. He believed they were free to innovate because they didn't have to carry the heavy canon of a Central European literature.
They could draw from Old Norse sagas, Anglo-Saxon poetry,
Buddhism, the Jewish Kabbalah, Islamic scholarship, all with equal freedom.
So his core belief was that this cosmopolitan reading made Argentine writing universally relevant, not just locally provincial.
And his personal politics mirrored this emphasis on freedom and the individual against the collective.
He identified as a mild classical liberal, influenced heavily by his father,
declaring himself a Spencerian anarchist who believes in the individual and not in the state.
It's important to clarify what that means in this context, right?
It is. Spencerian anarchism, from Herbert Spencer, emphasizes extreme individualism and minimizing state power. It's about personal liberty and voluntary cooperation.
And for Borges, this meant a staunch anti-communist and, most vehemently, an anti-fascist stance.
His anti-fascism was tested early and very personally. In 1934, Argentine ultranationalists,
who were certainly sympathetic to the rising Nazi movement in Europe,
they attempted to discredit him by asserting that Borges was secretly Jewish, trying to paint him as foreign, as non-Argentine.
Borges's response was spectacular and defiant.
He wrote the essay Yo Judeo, I, a Jew.
And in it, he declared he would be proud to have Jewish heritage.
And then he deployed his genealogical knowledge to argue that any pure Castilian like himself likely had ancient Jewish or Moorish descent anyway.
It was a sophisticated intellectual rejection of their racial nationalism.
And his political hatred for Nazism was fueled by a love for German culture. The Nazi police state's actions, like banning or rewriting classical German texts, were intellectual crimes to him.
He called the Nazi rewriting of history a chaotic descent into darkness.
And he used his fiction to analyze the pathology of fascism. In his 1946 story, Deutsches Requiem, he created the ultimate ideal Nazi.
An intellectual who valued violence for its own sake, completely detached from political victory.
Right. This Nazi narrator, reflecting on his defeat, concludes that defeats and victories are mere matters of chance. He asserts that the true victory was simply upholding the principle of necessary violence and absolute authoritarianism.
So Borges used this fictional device to explore the moral void at the heart of the fascist ideology.
Fascinating, isn't it? But the defining political conflict of his actual life was his relentless, bitter anti-Peronism.
When Juan Perón took power in 1946, Borges became an immediate, highly visible intellectual enemy.
And his intellectual resistance was met with administrative spite.
Borges, who was an outspoken supporter of the Allies during the war, was promoted from his quiet, scholarly post as a municipal librarian.
A job which paid just enough to allow him to write.
To the ludicrous position of inspector of poultry and rabbits at the municipal market.
I mean, inspector of poultry and rabbits. We just have to pause there and appreciate the sheer absurdity of the insult.
It's perfect Peronist pettiness.
It is utterly perfect, and it reveals the regime's contempt for the intellectual class. The idea was to humiliate him,
Forcing him either to resign or to dedicate his intellect to supervising meat quality.
a task completely beneath his professional standing. And when he demanded a reason for this demotion disguised as promotion, he was told simply, well, you were on the side of the Allies, what did you expect?
And he resigned immediately.
Turning a personal humiliation into a massive public symbol of intellectual resistance.
Absolutely. He became the intellectual leader of the anti-Peronist opposition.
At a dinner held in his honor following his resignation, a speech he wrote was read aloud,
Which contained one of his most powerful political statements.
asserting that dictatorships breed oppression, dictatorships breed servility, dictatorships breed cruelty. More loathsome still is the fact that they breed idiocy.
That word idiocy is doing so much work there. It frames dictatorship not just as evil,
but as intellectually beneath contempt. That was the core of his critique. He saw Peronism as an intellectual failure, a regression.
His battle with Perón lasted for decades. It served as an axis around which Argentine intellectual life rotated.
And when the military junta temporarily overthrew Perón in 1955, Borges was appointed director of the National Library in celebration.
But the conflict wasn't over. Perón was eventually re-elected president in 1973 after years of exile.
And Borges's immediate reaction.
He resigned the prestigious directorship at the National Library immediately.
He could not serve under Perón again. He didn't mince words, referring to the leader as a humbug.
In claiming that he had made Argentina look ridiculous to the world.
He cited specific examples of Perón's ridiculous claims, like the infamous 1951 announcement that Argentina had achieved control over thermonuclear fusion.
A claim, as Borges noted, that still hadn't happened anywhere but in the sun and the stars. His ability to inject this high-level historical and scientific context into petty political disputes is just remarkable.
His political trajectory was complex, however. While staunchly anti-Peronist, he did initially support the military junta that took over in the 1970s.
Hoping for stability and an end to populism.
But he was quickly and profoundly scandalized by their brutal actions during the Dirty War.
By the time democracy returned with Raúl Alfonsín's election in 1983, Borges had returned to his faith in classical democratic values.
He had. And he even offered his unique literary commentary on the 1982 Falklands War.
Writing a short, evocative poem about two fictional soldiers, one from Argentina, one from the UK, who died in the conflict.
His most memorable comment on the geopolitical absurdity of that conflict was classic Borges.
What did he say?
He called the war a fight between two bald men over a comb.
A perfect, cynical, and universally relevant encapsulation of why territorial conflicts often seem so pointless.
So his political engagement, born of these deep individualist beliefs, led to a life marked by bureaucratic spite, international controversy, and continuous intellectual fire.
Right then. Let's wrap up with the final ironies of his legacy and the greater mission. Okay, moving on from the political battles, we have to honor Borges's immense practical contribution to world letters.
Specifically as a translator.
His linguistic capacity was extraordinary. Fluent in Spanish, English, French, and German.
He also mastered enough Old English and Old Norse to translate them.
And his theoretical views on translation were revolutionary and, well, liberating for other writers.
He rejected the rigid idea that a translation must be perfectly faithful.
Instead, he maintained that a translation could actually improve upon the original.
Or be unfaithful, and that contradictory renderings of the same source material could all be equally valid literary achievements.
It ties back to his idea that absolute originality is a fictional construct.
It does.
And he didn't just translate European masters. Crucially, he created an indelible bridge between American and Latin American literature.
By translating William Faulkner's The Wild Palms in 1940.
And this exposed a whole new generation of Latin American writers, Juan Rulfo, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, to the psychological depth and fragmented narrative structures of contemporary American fiction.
This willingness to engage across genres and traditions was also evident in his extensive collaborations,
His partnership with fellow Argentine writer Adolfo Bioy Casares.
often under the pseudonym H. Bustos Domecq. This is a wonderful display of Borges's lighter side.
Tell us more about the Domecq works that often gets overshadowed by his philosophical fiction.
They created these parody detective stories and dark humor fantasies. The detective, Isidro Parodi, operates from a jail cell.
Another great Borgesian constraint and irony.
Exactly. The humor is dry and highly stylized, often parodying the Argentine social scene and the inflated rhetoric of the intelligentsia. It shows Borges' capacity for fun and satire.
Proving that his dry style was a tool, not a limitation.
And later, the collaboration with the American translator Norman Thomas Di Giovanni was key to his rise to fame in the English-speaking world.
Though that relationship became legally complex later on.
It did. But Di Giovanni helped introduce Borges to a mass audience in the 1960s and 70s.
That partnership gave him global visibility.
It did, but it wasn't without future complication. After Borges' death, his widow, Maria Kodama, aggressively asserted her rights over the works.
Which led to the revocation of the rights to Di Giovanni's translations.
Right, which resulted in a complex and sometimes contentious literary legacy regarding which translations were authorized.
Now we come to the monumental question. The Nobel Prize.
Ah, yes.
He was nominated over 30 times, considered a towering figure of 20th century letters, alongside contemporaries like Nabokov and Neruda.
Yet he never won.
He treated the whole affair with characteristic wit and irony, didn't he?
He did. He famously quipped that, "Not granting me the Nobel Prize has become a Scandinavian tradition."
We know he was frequently close. For instance, he was one of the final 3 choices in 1967.
The year the Guatemalan writer Miguel Ángel Asturias won.
So why the snub? The sources point clearly toward political controversy overriding his literary merit.
Absolutely. The decisive factor cited by at least one prominent committee member, Arthur Lundqvist, was Borges' acceptance of an honor from the Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet in the 1970s.
And Lundqvist cited this acceptance as making Borges an improper Nobel laureate for ethical and humane reasons.
Which is a devastating irony.
The man who risked his life and career fighting fascism and Peronism in Argentina.
The same man who wrote essays declaring pride in Jewish heritage against Nazi sympathizers.
Was denied the world's highest literary honor due to a single controversial gesture toward another authoritarian figure later in his life.
It's the ultimate tragedy of political labeling. He saw Pinochet initially as a necessary stabilizer against chaos.
Aligning with his anti-statist beliefs that sometimes preferred order over populism.
But this proved to be a political disaster for his international image.
Stepping back to the intellectual pillars that buttressed his work, we should just reinforce the philosophical influences we touched on earlier.
He consistently named Bishop George Berkeley and Arthur Schopenhauer as his 2 greatest philosophical influences.
Berkeley, the great idealist, who argued esse est percipi.
To be is to be perceived. This idealism provides the groundwork for Borges' preoccupation with dreams and the precariousness of external reality, exemplified in stories like Clun, Ukbar,
and Schopenhauer's influence.
Schopenhauer's pessimism and his emphasis on the illusory world of appearances, the idea that the phenomenal world is merely representation, driven by an irrational will, that lends Borges' stories their profound skepticism.
A skepticism regarding purpose and linear progression.
Borges' universe is rational but fundamentally meaningless, a very Schopenhauerian concept. He also played with concepts from mathematics, showing a sophisticated, if sometimes superficial, knowledge of set theory.
Which he used in stories like The Book of Sand to explore the nature of impossible collections and infinity. Finally, let's look at his end, which, like his life, was marked by contradiction and ecumenism. He declared himself an agnostic.
But he clarified that this didn't rule anything out. He specified that being an agnostic means all things are possible, even God, even the Holy Trinity.
And despite his intellectual skepticism, he maintained a lifelong practice of praying the Our Father nightly.
A promise he made to his Catholic mother. And he was raised with the Bible, taught by his English Protestant grandmother.
And in a final, very Borgesian act of literary and personal reconciliation before his death in Geneva in 1986.
The city he dedicated his final work, The Conspirators, to.
He requested 2 clergymen attend.
Yes, a Catholic priest in memory of his mother and their shared traditions,
And a Protestant minister.
in memory of his English grandmother who instilled in him his love of the English language and literature. He died in Geneva in the presence of the priest.
And the Protestant minister, Pasteur de Montmollin, later noted that Borges had unceasingly searched for the right word, the term that could sum up the final meaning of things.
And the ultimate irony and beauty is that he knew the search itself was a labyrinth. But the act of constructing that labyrinth is his meaning. Hashtag tag outro.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner?
Jorge Luis Borges mastered the synthesis of mythology, mathematics, and philosophy within these fictional miniature worlds. He created entire universes on just a few pages.
He was a man defined by radical, complex ironies. The blind librarian, the cosmopolitan nationalist, the anarchist who died in the presence of religious men.
He showed us that the essay could be a work of fiction, that criticism could be creation, and that the past is malleable.
He was obsessed with libraries and archives, and he gave us that ultimate writer's sentiment.
I always imagined paradise to be some kind of a library.
We end this deep dive with one final provocative thought, tying his life's irony to his most radical literary ambition. Borges believed that every writer creates his own precursors.
Meaning his work now permanently modifies our conception of the past and influences the future.
So, if Borges's own constructed universe, those 410-page libraries, those infinite lefts, those systems of forking paths, is now an indelible force in world literature, shaping how we write and how we read.
Does his paradise already exist within the infinite library he helped construct?
If every writer who comes after is unconsciously structuring their work according to rules he already summarized, what book written today is unconsciously copying a structure he already invented?
Something to consider the next time you pick up a dense collection of short stories or open a browser window and find yourself lost in an infinite stream of information.